We'll wait little bit. We'll wait couple of minutes. It seems still we have 13. Yesterday also got more participants. Minutes. Will it be all right for us to wait a couple of minutes?
Sure.
Yeah, that's fine.
Morning, Mr. Martin. How are you?
Morning. How are you?
Good. Thank you.
Yeah, sounds good.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen, joining us from various parts of the world. Today, we are going to have the third, which is also the final session of the 3-day national workshop on trading services organized jointly by the Department of Commerce of Sri Lanka, the World Trade Organization, and the Permanent Mission of Sri Lanka in Geneva. It's a pleasure to see that most of the participants who attended the previous 2 sessions are with us today also for this final session. I warmly welcome you all. Today we have with us Mr. Martin, who will be our first resource person from the WTO Secretariat. A very warm welcome to you, Mr. Martin. It's a pleasure to have you. Later, we will be joined by Mr. Marcus Chelito, who will be our next presenter as second presentation. As you all know, we found the first 2 sessions very interesting and useful. This session will also cover several important areas relating to trading services, especially services negotiations, and also negotiations on domestic regulations. Before we start off the program today, I want to put on record the excellent cooperation that we received from the Secretariat, from Mr. Marcus and Ms. Francie Martini, and also from Sheila Coyle and all others of the Secretariat. They are the people who coordinated this entire event from the very beginning. Thank you, Mr. Marcus, and although he is not here, and then Ms. Francine and Ms. Sheila for your hard work to make this event successful. Why I thought of putting these words at the very beginning, most probably I won't be able to attend the latter part of this session. And unfortunately, my ambassador, Excellency Ms. Silva, also will be able to make it today since he's having another engagement. So I thought that we should appreciate the services we are receiving from the Secretariat. And we wish to extend our special thanks to Ms. Bridget Pilala, Head of Technical Assistance, and Mr. Chai Chiolin, Director, Trading Services and Investment Division, for their guidance from the very beginning. And I wish to make use of this opportunity to extend our special thanks to the Department of Commerce in Colombo. Of course, the request came from them initially, and then of course this coordinated the program with the Secretariat. And this is a very good initiative. Of course, I think we have to have more programs of this kind. Not going to take much time since we have 2 presentations. This is going to be 3 hours today. So I would like to give the floor to Mr. Martin Roy, our first presenter. Mr. Martin, Roy is yours. Thank you.
Thank you for these kind words, and it's a pleasure to talk to you today. So in the time we have in the first part of the morning, I think the idea was to touch on 2 big topics. One is to have a discussion on the built-in mandate in the Agreement on Services in the WTO that relates to market access. So that's essentially Article 19. So to look a little bit at what this built-in mandate is about, how it links with development objectives, and to have a bit of an overview of what has happened so far under that mandate and what are the most recent discussions. Then we will move to a completely different topic, which is regional trade agreements on services, where we'll have an overview of recent trends in these regional trade agreements that focus or deal with services, and highlight some of the key differences with the GATS, to see how they kind of diverge or differ from the multilateral rules and obligations on that. So of course it's a lot of it. There are two big topics to deal with in a fairly short amount of time. So I want to be guided also by your questions, your reactions, so I can see which aspects I can focus on. So please don't hesitate to raise your hand virtually. If I don't react, it's because I haven't noticed it. So please just you can just raise your voice, take the floor, and then I'll be happy to give you the floor and to talk to you. So let me try to share my screen and start with the first presentation. Okay, I take it that you can see that properly.
Yes,
so,
that's fine, Mark.
Yeah, thank you. So let's start with discussing the built-in agenda under the GATS. And this is a particularity of the agreement on services. The reason for this built-in mandate under Article 19, I think, is that, you know, when the GATS is a fairly recent achievement. I mean, it was negotiated during the Uruguay round, and before that, there was basically nothing on services in the GATT, and so most of the efforts during the Uruguay round was to set up the basic framework for trade and services, you know, to define the modes of supply, to essentially work on negotiating what became, you know, the framework obligations on services within the WTO. But there was not a lot of time to actually negotiate in the Uruguay round, you know, countries' schedules of commitments on market access. And so I think for that reason, there was members felt a need, and in the end they agreed to have this built-in mandate in Article 19, which called for successive rounds of negotiations on services to take place with respect to market access and essentially to improve in a progressive manner the level of liberalization that is captured in schedules of commitment. And this built-in mandate you know, called for the first of those rounds of negotiations to begin in the year 2000. And so in this way, this means that the GATS is a bit on par with, in a way, with agriculture, because both have built-in mandates in the agreements themselves, and both of these built-in mandates called for negotiations to begin in the year 2000. And so it means that these two negotiations, these two mandates, were not linked to the Doha Development Agenda. Obviously, that came later. It was agreed later to start this round, which started in 2001. But by that time, preparations for the negotiation had already started. And the negotiations then indeed started in 2000. And this is when, in 2000, the special session of the Council for Trade and Services was established by the General Council, just as it was for the special session of the Committee on Agriculture. So they were established in 2000 with the mandate to carry out the task to carry out the built-in agenda under Article 19. So the objective of these negotiations, and you'll see, I think, when we look a bit at the process, you know, what followed from in these negotiations that started in 2000, you will see that actually members had a lot of, I guess, wisdom, when they agreed on all the different elements of Article 19 and of this built-in mandate, because, what followed after that in terms of procedures, guidelines, did not, add a lot more. I mean, of course, there was important value added that came after, but a lot of the core elements, the core principles and guidelines that framed the negotiations that followed then for many years was already built into the GATS, including with respect to the core objectives, but also all the different flexibilities and parameters. And we'll see some of those core aspects. So the key objective, progressively higher levels of liberalization with a view to promoting the interests of all participants, with a balance of rights and obligations. And then it's not only about liberalization and that's it. The mandate itself incorporates a number of flexibilities already in Article 19. So these did not have to be completely negotiated and established afterwards. It's already built into the mandate, due respect for the level of development of individual members, appropriate flexibility for developing countries in terms of opening fewer sectors, liberalizing fewer types of transactions. And then the other interesting part about Article 19 is that it is linked very closely to another key article of the agreement, which is Article 4. And Article 4 is the provision of the GATS that is titled the increasing participation of developing countries. And it is also refers to one of the key objectives of the GATS, which is to increase the participation of developing countries in global trade in services. And so Article 19 references Article 4, and Article 4 also cross-references Article 19. So if you look at Article 4, it talks about the fact that the increasing participation of developing countries shall take place through negotiated commitments. And so there is this idea that the increasing participation of developing countries is to some extent linked to negotiation of better commitments in schedules of members. These commitments should relate to a number of key objectives that are mentioned in Article 4, strengthening the domestic services capacity and efficiency of these in these developing countries, improving access to distribution channels, and also, importantly, and you'll see that aspect come up in further ministerial guidance, there is an obligation to take account of or to provide for market access in sectors and modes of supply of interest to developing countries. So these key aspects of links to the increasing participation of developing countries, to flexibilities, as remained a core aspect of the guidance that underlay these negotiations. Of course, and I don't want to talk too much about that because we have kind of achieved some key outcomes with respect to that, but Article 4 also provided that special priority should be granted to LDCs in view of the particular difficulties that they faced in undertaking negotiating commitments, also called for special priorities for them in terms of granting market access in their sectors of interest. Over time, as the negotiation progressed, this actually culminated in the waiver for the services waiver for LDCs, which was initially discussed in the special session. Now, as you know, it has been agreed and it is being implemented in the context of the Council for Trade and Services. The mandate also in Article 19 itself set out a few steps in terms of how these negotiations should take place. It called for negotiating guidelines and procedures to be established for the negotiation. It called for members to conduct an assessment of trade and services, including in relation to Article 4 and the increasing participation of developing countries. It called for modalities to be established on autonomous liberalization. Autonomous liberalization meaning that there was this idea that a lot of countries had liberalized autonomously, including since the Uruguay round, and that this should be kind of credited, that credit should be given to that in the context of the negotiations. Also modalities for the special treatment of LDCs. And again, this eventually led to the waiver for preferences for LDCs. The negotiating mandate under Article 19 also specifies that the negotiation, the process of liberalization shall be advanced through bilateral, plurilateral, and multilateral negotiations. So it already contemplates that, you know, all these means, these processes can be used to advance under Article 19. And as we'll see in a second, negotiation and services may be even more than in agriculture or NAMA, rely a bit less on the multilateral level. I mean, this, of course, the negotiation has been overseen at the multilateral level by the special session in plenary settings to discuss, you know, exchange views on how the negotiations were proceeding, to provide some oversight, you know, some guidance as necessary. But the real negotiation of the schedules is really taking place, as it had also in the Uruguay round, is taking place bilaterally. And I'll come back to that to discuss a bit how that process actually took place. But a lot of the negotiations were bilateral. So each member asking certain other members what they would like to see in their new schedule, in their offers, and also mostly as a result of the Hong Kong Ministerial Declaration, there were plurilateral negotiations in services. So these terms now are being used in maybe different contexts, but you know, the idea of bilateral, plurilateral negotiations to produce multilateral outcomes is not certainly something new. So that is for the mandate. So you see, there's a lot that is already kind of determined in there, facilitated the work of negotiations very significantly. Now, let me maybe guide you through some of the key steps in the negotiations, and then we can see if you have particular questions or issues you want to discuss. Just to point out, and I will share the slides with you so you have a bit more information that what I will actually go through, and if you have any additional questions or queries, we can be in touch and I can address that. Just wanted to highlight, because now we're in a phase where we're not really negotiating, but even in those phases where there's not active negotiations, there can be a lot of useful work that is being done. And before 2000, before the start of the mandated negotiations, members did a lot of work in terms of preparation, and they engage in an information exchange to essentially benefit developing countries, providing access to information on regulations and issues that affected trade and services. The Secretariat was tasked with by members to produce a number of horizontal studies looking at developments in services trade, but also as a preparation for the negotiation, the Secretariat was tasked with providing background notes in different sectors, which we updated, I think, a decade or so later. And this was really to provide a basis, an information basis for the negotiation. So to highlight, what are key economic features of different services sectors, how is trade taking place in those sectors, what are some of the policies that government have in place, what are some of the obstacles or barriers to services trade, what are the existing commitments in all these different sectors and so on. So a lot of information exchanged to help prepare for these mandated negotiation, in addition to some more technical work on classification issues and scheduling matters. So the negotiations began as mandated. As I said earlier, the special session was established by members, by the General Council, to carry the negotiating aspect, so that the kind of normal or regular business did not become intertwined with the negotiating issues. And so members actually were very effective in following up on the steps that were laid out in Article 19. They established negotiating guidelines. And so that document, I think you have on the platform, it's SL 93. It's a short document that members put together. And a lot of it is essentially draws on the provisions of Article 19. It draws on Article 4, so it reuses some of that same language, these same principles and parameters to put together these negotiating guidelines. There's a few aspects where it goes a bit beyond. It talks about being mindful of the needs of small and medium-sized enterprises. It talks about the respect for the structure and principles of the agreement. It also brings in the MFN negotiations. So the GATS also foresaw that MFN exemptions would be part of the negotiations. So it formally brings that in. It clarifies that no sector or mode of supply would be excluded a priori from the negotiations. It clarifies that the starting point for negotiations was to be the existing level of commitment, the existing schedules. So that's important because some might have wanted to start from a different standpoint, to start from the assumption that we would achieve a certain level, or that we would start by from the existing level of openness as opposed to the existing commitments. And so that was important for some members. And also there was a clarification that the request offer process was the main method of negotiation. So, members with particular interest in requesting other members, and then all members submitting an offer as a result of these, or in view of these requests and related negotiation. And so there was a bit of a recognition right from the start that services would be a bit different than agriculture or NAMA, because in those two areas, really the focus was on establishing modalities. And that is really a big difference between these different sets of negotiations, and really something that complicated a little bit the parallel negotiations in these key pillars. And why there wasn't modalities for services? Well, modalities in principle could make it easier, because they would because the request offer process, which is essentially bilateral, is very burdensome. It demands a lot of work. You have to prepare specific requests for all your trading partners. You have to meet with all these different trading partners, to which you will send different requests. You also receive different requests from different members to improve your commitments, and then you have to negotiate with all these different members. So it's a very burdensome process. And then modalities could, in principle, simplify this by, members agreeing on certain precise objectives or outcomes that should be reflected in the offers of improved commitments. And so that is the idea on NAMA or on agriculture. But in services, it doesn't really work, and there's a number of reasons for that. One is that it's the way the services schedules are built. The sectors are not defined in the same way that it may be for tariff lines and goods. And then the schedules themselves are not easily quantifiable in a very objective manner. You can list a sector or part of a sector, and then you have different modes of supply where you can list different limitations. They're not just one or two measures that you need to negotiate. It can be many different things, and there's no number attached to them. So it's very difficult to predetermine an outcome. And so this is why, request offer is the main mode of negotiation. Members were very efficient. They agreed on modalities for autonomous liberalization, modalities for special treatment of LDCs. And so you have the document numbers here if you're interested. They also agreed on scheduling guidelines, which is essentially an update on the earlier Uruguay-round document. So to assist members in terms of how to schedule, to draft their commitments. And there were some discussions on the assessment of trade and services, and I'll come back to that. So quickly, in terms of the how the negotiations progressed, it started with members establishing all these basic foundations in the first year or two. And then the next step was for members to exchange negotiating proposals. So each member circulated to all members their proposals, so essentially indicating the sectors where they had market access interest, and explaining why this was important to them. In 2001, of course, the Doha round started, and then services like agriculture became, of course, part of that broader negotiating effort. Initial dates for initial requests, initial offers were set. So initial requests were to be circulated by summer of 2002. So each member then sent out particular requests, so asking particular members, what kind of improvements they wanted to see in their offer. And then the initial offers were to be circulated by March 2003. So this actually went well. The requests, the requests were not notified to the Secretariat. We did not see the actual request, so this is a purely bilateral process. And then the initial offers were circulated. In 2003, of course, the Cancun ministerial did not succeed. It was followed by another ministerial in Geneva, which set a date for revised offers by May 2005. So you had the initial package of offer that were circulated in 2003. Sri Lanka did produce an initial offer as part of these negotiations. And then members discussed, they negotiated, they met each other, again, mostly bilaterally, to comment on each other's offer, to say, well, we would like you to also do this, and why didn't you do that? And maybe if you do this, we can do that. So basically bilateral negotiations. But I think, and then they agreed on a date for revised offers. So a second set of offers, with a deadline of May 2005. So a good number of members did circulate these revised offer. I don't think Sri Lanka did. And this was kind of the the steps that led us to the Hong Kong Ministerial. And the Hong Kong Ministerial, essentially, before that, in the months preceding it, there was a lot of discussion in the special session and plenary setting. The chair of the special session at that time reported on the offers that had been circulated, the initial and revised offers. He provided some basic, assessments of these offers. Members commented on that. And essentially at that time, I think the chair's assessment was that, these offers were really of, limited quality, to put it mildly. So they were really, modest initial and revised offers in terms of, the extent to which they provided, significant changes from the pre-existing commitments. And so that context led members to discuss, how do we give further impetus to the services negotiations in view of the Hong Kong Ministerial. So there was a lot of activity, there was a lot of discussion in the special session in view of the Hong Kong Ministerial. There was some consideration, of whether we need to have some kind of modalities and quantitative thresholds or objectives for the services negotiation, because a lot of members were not happy with, the process. Again, very burdensome to negotiate bilaterally and have to ask every member to improve in particular areas. And so there was a lot of discussion on whether we need to have modalities for services, how to improve the process. And that essentially led us to the result in Hong Kong, which is certainly the most significant ministerial outcome we ever had on services, which is captured in Annex C of the Hong Kong Ministerial Declaration, and which was really intended to keep services on par with what was expected to happen on agriculture in Nama, and really give them a further push in terms of substance and also in terms of process. And so the Annex C from the Hong Kong Ministerial Declaration, in which ministers really focused on services, did a number of, I think, important things. So it set out not modalities and certainly not quantitative requirements, because there was that discussion, but I think it became clear that this was not really possible for services. But members did agree on overall objectives in a more detailed manner, objectives that all offers should aim to meet. And so there was some horizontal guidance by mode of supply, so I'll come back to that. Just objectives in terms of the clarity of the schedules, avoiding economic needs tests that are unspecified. Also recognition, and that is very important, recognition in that LDCs should not be expected to undertake new commitments. So they're essentially eventually they would get the waiver, but also in terms of their own commitments, they were not expected to do anything really. And so these objectives were really important, and this was really, pushed by a lot of developing countries, actually, and a lot of developing countries had interest in these objectives that came out of Annex C, because it was not only about particular sectors, and it allowed them to focus on the modes of supply that were of more interest to them, especially Mode 1 and Mode 4. And so the objectives, for example, without going into too much detail, in Modes 1 to 3, for Mode 1, no requirement of commercial presence, an objective that offers should, and the new commitments should essentially reflect, to the extent possible, the existing levels of access in Modes 1 and 2, aim to reduce economic needs tests in Mode 3, better levels of foreign equity participation in Mode 3, And in mode 4, aiming to have more commitments on categories of natural persons not linked to commercial presence, as well as on intracorporate transferees and business visitors. And so, these objectives agreed in Hong Kong were really pushed by a mix of developed and developing countries. In mode 4 in particular, this was pushed by developing countries, but also on mode 1, this was largely the effort of, at the time, India and with Hong Kong and Chile and some others that really laid out these general objectives for the negotiation. So to supplement and inform the bilateral negotiations. Another key development, I think, at that time that remains of some influence, still has some influence today, is that there was a recognition that the method of negotiation, shall remain request offer, but they introduced in Hong Kong a new process, a new method of negotiating. So moving beyond solely bilateral and moving to the plurilateral. And so they agreed that there would be a plurilateral request offer to supplement the bilateral process. And so we had these very important developments. So after 2005, where groups of members that had interest in particular sectors or particular modes of supply would submit plurilateral requests. So a joint request from a group of members in mode 4 or in financial services or whichever sector or mode, this group of members with common interests would send a common request to another group of members. And then they would meet, they would discuss, they would negotiate. And so that took place from in early 2006, there were 22 or 23 plurilateral requests that were formed, different groups were formed. There were 2 rounds of negotiations between the requestee and those that produced this. And so there was a certain amount of momentum that came out of this because of the substance of what was agreed in Hong Kong in terms of the objectives, and also because of this new process of negotiation. Unfortunately, for services, I guess, we did not see the result of that, of this new guidance that ministers provided in Hong Kong. We didn't see that reflected in subsequent offers. There were plurilateral negotiations that took place and exchanges, and members had prepared, and I started to think about how to prepare offers that would, more or less meet the objectives set out for different modes of supply in the Annex C of the Hong Kong Declaration, but we didn't see any offers that came out of this. And the reason was not because of services, but because of what happened in agriculture and NAMA. And so the deadline was for new revised offers in services to be tabled, circulated by July 2006. But NAMA and agriculture modalities were supposed to have been agreed in April so as to produce offers in those areas by July also, but they could not be agreed. And so as a result of that, the services revised or second revised offers could not be circulated. So we did not see the end result of that. And so, Hong Kong is to some extent the highest point in the services negotiation, but because of blockages elsewhere, we did not really see it reflected in draft offers. So that's something to keep in mind. So after that, there was different efforts to try to progress. Negotiations were suspended, as you may know, in 2006. And then in 2007, they reinitiated that. There was a ministerial meeting, a mini ministerial meeting in the summer of 2008, where there was the signaling conference on services. But again, failure to agree on modalities for agriculture and NAMA, and that essentially prevented services from progressing further. Throughout the negotiations, there was efforts by members to assess the negotiations, including with respect to the objectives laid out in Article 4 on the increasing participation of developing countries. That process not only took place before the negotiation, but throughout the negotiation. And it was agreed by members that this would be a continuous process. It was also understood that, this assessment of trade and services for the negotiation was to be undertaken by members. So not necessarily something that, of course, the council would agree on, but each member would have their assessment and they would share with the membership. Many members provided submissions to contribute to this assessment. Sri Lanka made also a contribution to that, which focused on the objectives or assessing trade and services in view of the objectives of increasing the participation of developing countries. So after that, the period after 2008 and the failure to agree on modalities for Ag and Nama, it was a slow descent into non-negotiations. So different efforts that essentially did not work out, and I think you're quite familiar with that. So from Bali to Nairobi, which essentially, recognized that not specifically on services, but generally, there was an understanding that members, could not agree on how to carry out these negotiations further. And this was again taken up at Buenos Aires. Now, if we look at, the offers that were exchanged and submitted and try to assess, it's very difficult to assess their quality, but we can have a look to see how much value added they might have provided compared to existing levels of commitments. And existing levels of commitments in the GATS are generally, fairly modest in that, the majority of WTO members don't have commitments in the majority of sectors. And so offers have to be kind of seen in that light, and again, we also have to keep in mind that these revised offers, the last offers that were submitted, did not reflect, they were submitted essentially for the most part before the Hong Kong ministerial. So they do not reflect the guidance that was agreed in Hong Kong, unfortunately, and they do not reflect the plurilateral process, requests and offers that took place in 2006 as a result of the Hong Kong ministerial. But still, we have 71 initial offers that were circulated. So the initial offer is essentially the existing schedule with an indication of how it would be improved. So what are essentially offers of improvement to existing schedules? So 71, counting the EU as one offer, and 31 revised offers were submitted. Now, it's very difficult. You cannot really quantify, the value of schedules or the value of offers. But, this gives you a general idea. So, for example, in professional services, where we can see that, in red, you see the number of existing schedules that were where there were proposals to improve commitments. So existing commitments or members that already had commitments in professional services and where there were some offers to take on better commitments in that sector. And then in green, which is much smaller for most sectors, you see those members that had no commitments at all in a particular sector and that offered to take commitments for the first time. So you see that overall, of course, there was a good effort, good initial effort, but that, the offers, initial or revised, were fairly limited in terms of their the value added they would have provided for existing schedules. You also see that there are some sectors, for example, audiovisual, health services sectors that were more difficult even in the Uruguay round. And then, in the offers, these sectors also were difficult. So few members offering better commitments where they already had some, and, even fewer members proposing commitments for the first time. Now, another way to assess, or a fairly objective way to assess the offers, is to look at the sectoral coverage. So essentially to look at, not to quantify the level of openness, but just to look at how many sectors, or in this case, subsectors, are committed. How many subsectors are included in the schedules or the offers. So out of 160 subsectors or so, what proportion, what percentage are included in schedules of members. And so in blue, you have the average, about a third or so on average of sectors are included in schedules. And with the offers, then this percentage would have increased a little bit, but still remains very limited. Okay, so limited value added, but I think, again, it's because members didn't have the chance to really follow up on what was agreed by all ministers in Hong Kong, and that really didn't have much to do with services per se, I would think. Now, more recently, just a quick word, but I can come back to that if there are particular questions. But more recently, since MC11, we've had discussions, active discussions in the special session. So in 2018, mostly 2019, 2020, 21, we had active discussions following a long period of minimal activity in the council. And this followed up on some proposals by some members who wanted to have discussions to, share views on their areas of interest in different sectors without prejudice to negotiations. And so there's a number of submissions that were made by groups of members in different sectors. And so they would, depending on the sector, but they would typically highlight, how the sector evolved in recent years and what were some of the key trade issues in their view, what was the state of commitments in the sector, and what were their market access motivations or interests in these sectors. And then, members would discuss, and they would agree, or they would, share further interests, or they would disagree. And so that discussion took place over the last few years. And so you see a number of references to these documents here. And then in the ministerial outcome document at MC12, there was a paragraph on services, which is not something that we had seen for a very long time, essentially since Hong Kong. So that was discussed at great length, as you would know, or some of you would know, in the special session. And essentially, the paragraph highlights the importance of services trade for the economy, for the WTO, underscores the importance of services trade and the recovery that countries are undertaking, highlighting challenges and opportunities encountered by members. And then the last part, which is of particular interest, acknowledging the need to facilitate the increasing participation of developing members, including LDCs in global services trade, including by paying particular attention to sectors and modes of supply of interest, of export interest to them. And that language, of course, is not something that, just fell out of the sky. It is very much linked to Article 4 and therefore Article 19. So the need to increase the participation of developing members. So that is, set out in Article 4, which is to be through negotiated commitments. And then the part about paying attention to sectors and modes of supply of export interest to them is also, language that is, inspired by what is in Article 4, and again linked to with links to Article 19. So here's and I can share with you, share some slides on the additional discussions that, or additional information on the discussions that took place in recent years, in more recent years in the special session in these different services sectors. But right now, of course, we're not, members are not actively negotiating. The mandate is still there. It is the built-in mandate on which members are supposed to engage. And so in view of the language in the ministerial outcome document, then members will have to see and exchange views and discuss, how to, increase the participation of developing countries in global services trade in view of, what is already built into the GATS, and to discuss, I would assume, what are sectors and modes of supply of particular interest to developing countries. And so that discussion will happen, and it will be for members to decide how they want to follow up on this guidance from ministers, which are essentially saying services are important, and it's true that they are important, even though it doesn't necessarily attract a lot of attention, but it is key for diversification, for economic growth, especially in the post-pandemic era. And now it's for members to see how to implement and follow up on that language. So let me stop there and see if you have any particular comments or questions on this overview.
Hi, Martin. I'm Sam from Department of Commerce, Colombo.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Maybe making its very summarized basis, whole story from Rugerau to today. And Martin, this is not a technical question, general question. Let's say if we take services as a standalone agreement and negotiated under the WTO, let me put it in a different way. So would you think that attaching liberalization with other areas like NAMA and agriculture, was it a major issue for services not to proceed? On the flip side, if we consider under the WTO, I know it is not possible, but consider as a standalone agreement, would you think that we could have finalized something by now under services negotiation?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's difficult to say. I mean, obviously the built-in mandate under the GATS is not linked to anything else. I mean, it just says that, members shall, because very little was done, in the Uruguay round on commitments, it just says that members shall engage in rounds of negotiations to achieve progressively higher levels of liberalization. So it's not linked to agriculture or to anything else. I mean, that mandate should be able to be carried out on its own. But of course, because the Doha round started a year after, then it all became, linked in a way. And clearly, I think that certainly the failure to agree on agriculture and NAMA then made it almost impossible in that context for services to move forward. I don't know. I think it should be possible to have something on services that even as a standalone. Maybe the level of ambition would be a bit different, but I think it should be possible. And there's a few reasons for that, especially now, because we're in a very different situation than we were 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, because now members have a lot more experience with trade and services compared to 2000. Members have a lot of regional trade agreements. Now, the majority of members have regional trade agreements on services, where they have taken commitments, much beyond the WTO. Even developing countries in South-South regional trade agreements, they have chapters on services that go beyond the GATS. And services, in terms of the economic importance, their importance in exports of developing and developed country has continued to increase. So these factors should normally make it more relevant and feasible for members to do something in the WTO. I mean, that's not without challenges, and the issue of flexibility and level of ambition would need to be adjusted to reflect what everybody wants. But the gap between the existing level of access that is guaranteed in the WTO and the economic reality of the openness of members, what they've done in RTAs, and the economic importance of services trade generally, the gap is very big. And so there's a lot, I think, that could fairly easily be done. But that's my own view. The politics of it are a bit different, of course. But I understand that countries want to link, they don't want to do something on services if some of their areas are not in other issues like agriculture are not, advancing. But I think it should be more an issue of level of ambition as opposed to all or nothing. But
yeah, sorry, frankly, this is my follow-up question related to what you already mentioned regarding this RTA. It's true, even our countries like ours also engage in a very huge countries on services liberalization, but we are not the first one. We are most probably people who enter the wagon late.
Yeah.
Is there any indication that the other countries experience RTA services experience to WTO and making progress on the multilateral level? Any signs building on regional levels, multilateral level? You see any trend or anything like that in the WTO?
Well, no, I mean, we don't see that reflected in the WTO in terms of commitments. I mean, I'll discuss with you RTAs in a second, I think, so we can look at what has been achieved there. But that has not been reflected in the WTO in terms of, market access commitments. I think what you see the influence of what has been done in RTAs on other aspects. So you see that in regional trade agreements, a number of members in such negotiation have experimented on domestic regulation obligations that Marcus will talk about. And so that has been, in a way, an inspiration for some of the discussions on domestic regulation here. On e-commerce also, members have experimented in regional trade agreements, and that has provided some inspiration for some proposals made in the WTO. But in terms of services, schedules, of course, we haven't had negotiations, so we haven't really seen anything. But, I mean, keep in mind that especially for, smaller economies, I mean, in a regional trade agreement, in a bilateral agreement, you would take probably a lot of GATS plus commitments in exchange for having, reciprocal or some commitments from the other side, but from only one member. In the WTO, you would probably take or offer these same new commitments, or probably even less, but in exchange, you would get commitments and better guarantees of access from 160 something members. So I think there's a lot of the potential is probably a lot bigger here in terms of what you can get, and also what you would offer probably would be less than what you do in a regional context.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Very good question. Any other comment or question? Okay, let me say a few words about regional trade agreements. So let me try to share another set of slides. And so again, there's a lot that can be said or discussed about regional trade agreements, and I know Sri Lanka is engaged in a number of negotiation, but it's not one of those countries that is, that has ratified most regional trade agreements covering services. But so there's a lot of issues we can talk about, but I want to focus on maybe just a few, and then see, what particular interest or question you would have. But just a few words about some of the main trends. I think the most important trend here is that, despite the fact that commitments at the multilateral are fairly limited, there has been, and the negotiations are not advancing, there has really been a proliferation of services RTAs in the last year. So this is a fairly recent phenomenon, as you can see in this chart. So, before 2000, so in the first years of the WTO, there were really few regional trade agreements that covered services. So you had the EU, some European arrangements, you had the NAFTA, but very few agreements and very few members being involved in that. But as you see, this trend has really increased very significantly in recent years, and now the majority of members are party to at least one regional trade agreement on services. And so we've gone from less than 10 agreements notified under GATS Article 5 to almost 200 in a very short period of time. And it's not only the number. I mean, it's also the economies, the countries that are involved in these negotiations. So all the main exporters and importers of services in terms of size are involved, and they're negotiating agreements, and securing market access amongst themselves. So the European Union is particularly active. Japan, China now are also very active. This is a bit more recent. In Asia, of course, is one of the most active region, ASEAN, Singapore, and so on. And more recently, you see a number of newer trends in services RTAs. One, maybe the more important ones, are that we see bigger agreements that not only on services, but that cover services. So bigger regional trade agreements that cover many more parties. So RCEP is one example, of course, in your immediate region. CPTPP also, PACER Plus, which is with the Pacific Islands. So that is one of the newer trends. Another more recent trend is the fact that a lot of these regional trade agreements on services, especially in more recent years, are South-South agreements. So now it's becoming a standard feature of all trade agreements to have a chapter on services, to have commitments on services. Well, 20 years ago, it was more the exception. Now it is typically the rule. And the other important trend, I think, especially in recent years, is that we have more and more agreements that are linking on services the larger economies. And, you know, at the beginning of this phenomenon, there was, we were kind of thinking, well, a lot of these RTAs are, you know, between big countries and smaller ones. And, you know, the WTO remains the main, you know, place for the biggest countries to have their services trade governed. So governed at the level of the WTO and not in a bilateral agreement. And I guess we took some comfort in that, but now it's starting to maybe go a bit the other way, in that you have agreements like, for example, it's starting to link some of the biggest economies between themselves. So you have the RTA between the EU and Japan, for example. Of course, the RCEP that links you know, China with the ASEAN and Australia and so on, and Japan. You have India-Japan regional trade agreements, Canada-EU. And so there's still no agreement, of course, between US and China, US and India, but some of the bigger economies are starting to be linked and governed at the regional level on services, and not solely as before in the WTO. Now, if we look into the content of the regional trade agreements on services, and we try to analyze and look at, you know, what are their main features, but also what is the difference with the GATS. I think you can look at it in different ways. I think the three main ways to compare them and to look at that. One is to look at how they differ in terms of the structure or the architecture. So essentially the liberalization modalities, how commitments are structured. The other one is to look at the key obligations, whether this is the same as the GATS or not. And then the third one is to look at how much market access is achieved. So the commitments in regional trade agreements compared to the GATS. I think in terms of the key obligations, this is not where there has been the most innovations. I mean, there are some agreements that do innovate, that go beyond the GATS in terms of the obligations, whether in domestic regulation or with respect to Mode 4 or with respect to e-commerce and, you know, related areas like investment and so on. But it's not the area, you know, where there's been a revolution. I mean, you still have the modes of supply defined the same way, national treatment, market access. You know, there's not a lot of change in terms of the core obligations overall. I think where there's been more of a revolution or more significant changes, generally speaking, is with respect to structure and then to market access. So maybe I say a few words about this, the structure or architecture. And this essentially refers to the modalities for liberalization, where I think RTAs, and you would be confronted with that, I think, in a number of regional trade agreement negotiations, because typically in those negotiations, governments will spend and officials will spend a lot more time to discuss the general approach, the general feature. Is it going to be a positive list agreement? Is it going to be a negative list? They can spend a lot more time arguing about that than arguing about the details of what is actually committed, you know, the actual level of commitments on market access. And so what we see in regional trade agreements is, of course, a number of agreements just take the GATS architecture, the GATS approach to scheduling and to liberalize, which is the positive list approach. So positive list meaning, you know, like in the GATS schedule, each government, each country decides the particular sectors in which it will undertake commitments on market access and national treatment. So national treatment, market access only apply to sectors listed in the schedule, and then along with the limitations scheduled there. And so a number of RTAs, especially at the beginning, in the earlier period, such as Mercosur, a lot of the EFTA and EU agreements have followed essentially GATT's approach, so positive listing, which, typically in the GATT's context had been pushed by developing countries as, because it provided more flexibility and so on. But one of the key innovation in regional trade agreement was the negative list approach, which essentially started with the NAFTA, and then it spread to many other countries, especially in Latin America, and then to many countries in Asia, Japan, Korea, and others starting to use it. And now it's spreading even more, and it has become now the main feature of regional trade agreements on services. Now, the majority of these agreements actually use a negative list approach. So what is a negative list approach, and what is the key difference? And again, you will be confronted with those questions in regional negotiations. So the key difference, I think, in terms of the negative list, positive list, is of course that in a negative list, you start with the assumption that everything is open. You start with the assumption that full market access, full national treatment is provided across all sectors. And then you need to identify, the limitations, the reservations that you want to maintain. Okay, so the starting point is the opposite of that of a positive list. Positive list, the starting point is you have no commitments on anything, and then you need to add particular sectors where you would take commitments. In a negative list, everything is deemed to be fully open, except to the extent you schedule something that indicates otherwise. Okay. And the way this is done in a negative list context is that members will produce not a schedule of commitment, but they will produce annexes of non-conforming measures, okay, essentially where they will list the restrictions that they want to maintain. They will list the measures inconsistent with market access or national treatment that they want to maintain. And they will list that in two main annexes. One annex, which is the main one, the default one, Annex 1, which essentially will be to list existing measures, existing non-conforming measures. Okay, and what that means is that it's not like in the GATTs where you put a sector and then you can list whatever limitations you want to maintain, whether these are actually existing, whether you apply them in practice or not. Here in the regional trade agreements, the presumption is that you will list existing measures, so measures that you actually have in place, that you have, embedded in your laws and regulations. Okay, so the basic idea is that you would bind the status quo. You would provide for a standstill by listing all these existing non-conforming measures in what is Annex 1. The way to list it is a bit different than in a positive list agreement like the GATTs, but essentially you would list, the measure that is inconsistent. You would indicate the source of the law where it's contained, and so on. So this is the main annex and the main feature of a negative list agreement. So in this Annex 1, you would provide for a standstill. So you need to list all your existing restrictions. And then you have also in not all, but almost all of the negative list regional trade agreements, you have this ratchet mechanism. So I don't know if you've been confronted with that probably at some point, but a ratchet mechanism, what is it? It applies only for these existing non-conforming measures that are listed in Annex 1. And it essentially provides that it's a mechanism that ensures that any future liberalization of these existing restrictions that you listed will be automatically bound. So any future liberalization becomes automatically your new level of commitment. Okay, so if, for example, you have a foreign equity restriction in telecommunications, 49%, you list that in your annex because it's an existing restriction. You list that, you want to maintain the right to use it. But in the future, the government, for whatever reason, decides to get rid of it and permit 100% foreign ownership. Well, automatically that becomes your new commitment, and you cannot go back to 49% at some other point in the future. So that is something, of course, that doesn't exist in the GATS or typically in positive list agreements, but is found in most negative list regional trade agreements, which now form the majority of services RTAs. Now, at the same time, you also have some exceptions to that. Everybody has their own sensitivities, sensitive sectors or issues. And so that is dealt with in these negative list RTAs by having a second annex where you have a bit more leeway. So essentially, we call it an annex for future measures, where you not only bind the existing level, but you reserve the right to adopt new restrictions in the future with respect to a particular sector or a particular issue or mode or whatever. So for example, if the European Union doesn't want to have commitments on audiovisual services, then it would indicate that in the second annex, where it would say, well, we reserve the right to adopt any restriction that we want with respect to audiovisual services. So they would list that in this Annex 2. So where you would not be bound by the standstill or status quo requirement. Okay, so this is the big difference. You know, I think maybe the biggest difference between what is happening at the regional level on services and what is happening in the W2, the main, innovation. And there's a few reasons for that, because these RTAs, in a way, they try to, they build on what has been done in the WTO. So they want to correct for what they see has been some insufficiencies in the WTO. And also, it's a different context. I mean, in the regional level, you're not going to have typically successive rounds of negotiations. In most RTAs, you negotiate once and that's it. And so in that context, maybe it doesn't make the same sense as in the WTO to kind of leave many sectors uncommitted. And also, the key difference with services and goods is that for goods in regional trade agreement, the basic idea is that you bring down the tariff, which is the only barrier permitted. Essentially, you bring down the tariff to zero over a period of time. Now, in services commitments, countries don't really do that. Countries don't really, most of the time, they don't reform and get rid of existing barriers a lot as a result of negotiations. The main objectives in services negotiations is a bit different. It's not to bring down over time the barriers to zero. It's more typically to provide more certainty, more transparency, and to bind the existing level of openness, which the GATS doesn't do a whole lot. And so this is why in negative list RTAs, the key objective is to bind the existing level of openness. And then since there's not going to be more likely a future round, and since countries are not, negotiating a timetable to bring down existing barriers to zero, then they introduce this idea of a ratchet, so that if governments autonomously decide to liberalize, then this becomes the new commitment over time. So I think this is the key feature. So I don't know if you would have particular questions on that. I just want to highlight maybe some recent developments which are important, because typically at the beginning of, the negotiation of these regional trade agreements, you had some members that preferred positive list, others that did negative list, and these were completely different camps. But now that, a lot of these, the easier negotiation or more obvious ones have been done at the regional level, these countries that had very different approaches have started to negotiate amongst themselves. And that produced some interesting hybrid and innovations in terms of and some mixes between positive and negative list modalities that I think are quite interesting. But maybe one interesting one is what has been done in RCEP. And that is quite interesting, because there you had countries that before only done or mostly done positive list. So most of the ASEAN countries had only done positive listing. China had done positive list. India, which of course took part in the negotiation but did not join in the end, had also favored positive listing. And then you had others like Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Japan that typically favored negative list modalities. And so there was this, tough negotiation, I would assume, to try to decide whether we use one or the other. And in the end, what they decided is very interesting. And they decided that you could choose. So the parties to the negotiation and to the agreement can choose whether they list their commitments on services, on market access, national treatment, whether they list these commitments on the basis of a positive list, GATS type approach, or they use negative list modalities. So it's a very interesting compromise. And so some countries decided to list on a positive list basis, others negative list. But the key issue there is that there is an obligation to transition to a negative list after a set period of time. So even those countries like, Laos or Vietnam or China that listed on a positive list basis, they are obligated to produce and transition to a negative list set of commitments by, I forget the exact number of years, 5 or 7 years, and longer for some of the LDCs like Laos or Cambodia. So that's a very interesting development. And of course, in the end, India did not sign on to the RCEP, but there was an agreement signed between Australia and India, a regional trade agreement on services signed recently. I don't think it's in force and ratified yet, but it has been signed. And then they essentially adopt the same approach as in RCEP. So positive list or negative list, each can choose. So Australia doing negative list, India doing positive list, but then India agreed to transition towards negative list modalities 6 years after the entry into force. So these are, I think, very interesting developments in regional trade agreements on services. The other aspect, quickly, I can leave you with more data on this, and you can find some in the WTO website. But of course, one key difference between what is done at regional level and the WTO is that at the regional level, commitments overall, on average, tend to be a lot more substantial. And so it's not only about replicating the GATS commitments or just adding a few small things. Typically, the level of commitment achieved in regional trade agreements on services is a lot more significant overall at the regional level. So you see that, for example, if you look at the sector coverage, so what we discussed earlier in terms of the number or proportion of services sectors committed in member schedules. So in the WTO or in GATS offers by comparison. So depending on mode 1 and mode 3, it's a bit different, but you see between, overall around 33% or so of sectors committed. And you see at the regional level, then it's a lot more than that, which is not really surprising. So a big difference between what is done at the regional and what is done at the multilateral level there. Key challenge for negotiators, well, you probably would have maybe a better idea for me. There's a number of key differences between, services negotiation and services outcome at a regional level compared to the WTO, and the challenges for negotiators also, it's a bit different. I think the main challenge, from what I've heard anyway, but you can correct me, is not so much the negotiation in itself. It's all the work that has to be done before. And a lot of the work that has to be done before, it doesn't matter really if it's a positive list or negative list agreement. It's really to do this survey of all your existing measures, to really identify at different levels of government have a look at all the laws and regulations to really identify what is your applied regime. What kind of market access restrictions do you have in place? What kind of national treatment restrictions do you have in your laws or regulations, if any, in all the sectors and in all the modes? So this is the basic, set of information that you need to have when you prepare for negotiations, when you then negotiate and craft your commitments. And typically all the work that goes into that, all the consultation, all the coordination with the different ministries, different levels of government is really, typically more challenging and more work than the actual negotiation themselves. And so that's maybe a bit different from the goods side, where the information is typically more, has been available and established to a greater extent beforehand. So I will stop there and see if you have particular questions or comments, given that I understand you are involved in some regional trade negotiations that would cover services. And I guess this is a fairly recent development for you. So I open the floor to see if you have any questions or comments.
Martin, thank you. This is Sam again. By looking at your last slide, so I want to frankly tell that we are right now grappling with these things, particularly lost in translation with the line ministries. And it's lucky you mentioned these points. I know we cannot tax WTO on these matters, but we are in touch with some other consultants. So to get resolved some of these challenges, this is a comment, frankly, that is the main issues right now. We also grappling with how to overcome these challenges to meet with this our RTA negotiations. The last slide, I would say that is to the point, and it's a very valid issues right now we are facing with. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it is a lot of work. It is not easy work, but I mean, it's a long time. I think it's a long time investment, because I mean, once you've done it once, I mean, you've done it in one time to prepare for one RTA, and that becomes and you take commitments on that basis, and you've done all you've identified your existing levels of restrictions. Then that work is largely done for future agreements. So you may spend, I don't know, a lot of time now to do this work for one or two particular negotiations, but then for the subsequent negotiations after that, it would be a lot less work. And you see that with countries that when they first started to do negative listing, they went through all this very heavy quantity of work to survey their own regime and so on. But then after that, once they've done that and reflected it in often in negative list agreement, then they just work on that basis for all the other agreements with only minimal changes, you know. So yeah, you have to see it. I'm trying to encourage you. So it's a lot of work, but I think it's a long-term investment, because then you will have your basis, you know, for all the other negotiation, and most of the work will already have been done. But one of the key challenges, and I assume it's more or less the same everywhere, but to maybe different extents, it's loss in translation. It's a bit also domestically, because you have the difficult task, you know, the trade ministry to go and reach out to the sectoral ministries and other ministries to, you know, to explain, you know, what it is you're doing, and how to reflect their measures and national treatment and market access limitation in a schedule, and you have to explain the modes and, you know, all of these things. So, and they also so you have the trade expertise that you have to communicate, and they have the sectoral expertise, which they're also trying to communicate to you. So yeah, in the end, it's better for everybody, but it's this exchange of expertise is not always obvious, but it's for the greater good. So good luck with that.
Thank you.
Any other question or comment? Good. So I wish you all the best. I will share these slides now and put them on the platform. If there's anything you want to follow up on, either with respect to Article 19 of the GATS or with regional trade agreements, any particular or more specific issue you want to discuss in writing or otherwise, please let me and my colleagues know, and we'll follow up with you on that. Okay. So good. I will now leave it to Marcus to continue on domestic regulation. If you're there, Marcus.
I am indeed, Martin.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. I'll take over. Okay, colleagues, it's my pleasure also to come in here at the very end of this workshop. I have coordinated it from our side, so I hope the last 2.5 days that you've had already were interesting and fruitful, and you've exchanged views with my colleagues so far. So now on the program, we have domestic regulation, and I'll share my screen for you. That's the right presentation. Can everyone see that?
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Perfect. Yeah. So just I don't know how my colleagues handled it, but if you have, while I speak, if you have a question or a comment or so, you can either drop it in the chat, or even better, if you just you know, react by raising your hand, and I'll see that you want to say something. I will pause at a few spots in the presentation and ask you actively if you have any comments or questions, so that we can make it a little bit more interactive. The presentation is a little bit long for the remaining 45 minutes that we have. So I will, and I know that the day is getting late on your side, so I don't want to keep you too long. So I'll try to do the best possible to go through, but like Martin, also I'm also available for discussions after the session, offline and online. And you have also received, I believe, in your virtual classroom, a wealth of background documentation and research on domestic regulation that you can look up. So let me start with the presentation. So there are 4 issues that I would like to address in this presentation. I want to start, of course, with the origins of WTO work on domestic regulation, the multilateral negotiations. And then I want to move and discuss with you the plurilateral negotiations that have taken place at the JSI, the content of the reference paper, the domestic regulation disciplines, and at the end, I wanted to briefly touch on some research that the WTO and the OECD have conducted with regard to the DR disciplines, how prevalent they are in existing RTAs, and also potential economic benefits from the implementation of domestic regulatory disciplines. So these are the topics that I want to address in the next 30-35 minutes. Let me start with the multilateral angle. And here, of course, it's quite important to remember at the beginning where domestic regulation fits in as a piece of the puzzle into the GATS. You know, we talk about regulatory measures when we talk about the GATS, and in a way, all GATS relevant measures are some kind of domestic regulatory measures. They're implemented typically in the territory of the country and applicable to service suppliers who operate in the territory. But as you know, in the nomenclature of services agreements, there are two types of regulatory measures which are identified, defined as trade restrictions, restrictions on market access, and restrictions on national treatment. The former being essentially, by and large, quantitative restrictions, so quotas, limitations on the number of suppliers, on the size of service suppliers, on the participation of foreign capital and the like. And the other type of measures that we define as restrictions are discriminatory measures. In other words, measures that modify the conditions of competition in favor of local services or service suppliers to the disadvantage of foreign services and services suppliers. So on the right-hand side of the slide, you see the remaining types of measures to which the GATS has found some type of response also. So in other words, the blue part here relates only to measures that do not fall under market access and national treatment. So they are qualitative, non-quantitative, and procedural requirements. And we have in Article 6 of the GATS already kind of a skeleton of obligations that relate to the administration of measures of general application that are not trade restrictions. We have obligations on providing at least one level of review for administrative decisions, be it administrative review or judicial review. We have specific skeleton provisions on the application process to obtain authorization to supply a service, namely that these procedures where authorization is required to supply a service, according to Article 6.3 of the GATS, the authority has to process these applications within a reasonable period of time, and upon request of the applicant, provide the applicant with information on the status of the application. And also with regard specifically to professional services where a member has made specific commitments, i.e. market access and national treatment commitments, that member has to have procedures in place domestically to verify the competence of professional service suppliers from foreign jurisdictions. In addition, in the GATS, we have a range of transparency provisions in Article 3 and Article 4.2. We have the GATS Annex on telecommunication services and trade and financial services, which contain additional transparency obligations. And then we have the reference paper on basic telecommunications, which is a sector-specific set of disciplines applicable to the telecommunication sectors, which is not actually a part of the GATS agreement, but it is a subsequently developed set of disciplines that members have implemented or incorporated into their services schedules as additional commitments. So this is something that was developed after the GATS was created in the context of the extended negotiations on basic telecommunications. And then, of course, we have the famous mandate in Article 6.4 to develop disciplines to ensure that licensing, qualification, and technical standard matters do not constitute unnecessary barriers to trade and services. So this is this mandate, this famous mandate on which subsequent work in the WTO was based. So you can see that the scope of this mandate is, first of all, one can see that there is a recognition by the membership that these types of measures can create barriers to trade. And the idea of this article is to mitigate, to avoid the unnecessary types of barriers to trade that these types of measures can create. And in terms of guidance, Article 6.4 spells out 3 objectives that these disciplines should achieve. Namely, they should be based on objective and transparent criteria, such as competence and the ability to supply the service, not more burdensome than necessary to ensure the quality of the service, and in the case of licensing procedures, not in themselves a restriction on the supply of service. And these are objectives that exist inter alia, so members would be free to add other objectives or develop disciplines in other measures with regard to other areas if they feel that that was necessary. So here I will not go into a lot of detail on the processes, because that in itself is a very interesting but very long presentation. But just to leave with you that members were actually active on the domestic regulation file since the establishment of the GATS, and they started working in 1995 on a pilot case, so to say, namely on the development of disciplines for the accountancy sector, which were adopted in December 1998. You have the document reference here on the slide. The idea there was to take a test case of one service sector that is fairly internationally integrated, where there was a lot of interest by the sector itself to be disciplined, so to say, by the WTO, and where the focus on one specific sector was seen to be less daunting by members at the time than looking at cross-cutting disciplines that would be equally applicable to all services sector. So that work was relatively successful. I will not go into the details of these disciplines, but what happened afterwards in 1999, that the Working Party on Professional Services was disbanded, and a working party on domestic regulation was established with the objective to carry on the work on professional services, but first and foremost to work on cross-cutting disciplines of a horizontal nature. The work then was exploratory for many years. Members shared with each other measures that they considered should be disciplined. They reached out to their sectors and got input from their sectors and shared that with each other. There was a lot of kind of academic work, fact-finding work on the parts of members, and negotiations then really started in 2005. They got a big boost from the Hong Kong Ministerial Declaration, which urged members to work on text-based negotiations that could be harvested at the next ministerial conference. And now this is quite important. Now what happened was that there was a really very intense work between, I would say, 2006 and 2008, 2009, and this work was supported with the participation of a large number of WTO members. So there were more than 60 members who signed off on specific text proposals. So these included a lot of developing countries, including the small and vulnerable economies as a group. The African group had a proposal. And of course, developing countries with a very strong services interest like India and some Latin American countries also had quite substantive text proposals. These text proposals were then kind of combined, and negotiations were taking place until, I would say, 2009. There were 3 chairpersons' texts, the last one from 2009 and the subsequent what is called progress report from 2011, but real negotiations were on the wane when in 2008 and certainly in 2011 it became clear that the broader negotiations that were taking place in the DDA were in serious trouble. The market access negotiations were deadlocked in NAMA, in agriculture, and subsequently, or as a result of that, also in services. And members had always looked at these domestic regulation disciplines as something that would be an attachment, a kind of a supplementary element to a successful market access negotiation. Because the design of these disciplines was always to essentially underpin existing market access commitments of members to ensure that in sectors where more openness was granted through negotiations, you would not have behind the border measures that would frustrate and disturb commerce that would flow in these newly liberalized sectors. Also, this linkage of DR disciplines with market access was always there. After the breakdown in 2011 of the negotiations, there was very little work between 2011 and 2016. But of course, what happened at that time was that for trading goods, the trade facilitation agreement was adopted in Bali in 2013. So in 2016, a group of WTO members, the traditional proponents of DR, among them several developing countries, so the traditional proponents would be Australia, New Zealand, the EU, and then there were some developing countries such as Colombia, Chile, Mexico, Hong Kong, China, who were also very active and interested in reviving these negotiations. And they felt it would be possible perhaps to restart negotiations on domestic regulation on a standalone basis, i.e. without any accompanying market access negotiations. They were shown to be wrong in their assumption because in 2017, the negotiations in the WPDR reached a very clear impasse. And the calculation that they had not made was that many developing countries would be opposed to adopting DR disciplines outside conclusion of market access negotiations. And then by extension, since not all developing countries were particularly interested in services, by extension, without a solution of negotiations in other areas of interest to developing countries, many of them naming agriculture as an issue. What was important with this impasse, however, was another aspect, a qualitative aspect. Before 2016, all members who negotiated recognized the importance of DR disciplines, and they recognized that the work, the draft texts of the chair were a basis for these negotiations. The main concern of developing countries were twofold. On the side of India, it was to secure meaningful disciplines with regard to the facilitation of movement of professionals, so with regard to qualification requirements and procedures. And for India and other developing countries, it was to ensure that whatever was agreed, however useful it would be to be agreed, would not create undue burden on their implementation capacities. But in 2017, there was a different notion to this, particularly raised or exclusively raised at that point by the African group and the LDC group. The African group at the time led by a very vocal and powerful, I would say, coordinator from South Africa, and the LDC group led by Uganda at the time. They exhibited in their own words, a fundamentally different approach. They did not think that any of these proposals on their own merit were useful for developing countries. They thought in principle, new obligations on DR were a negative thing for the development aspirations of these economies. So there was a qualitative difference. It was no longer about having sufficient flexibilities, but it was about challenging whether any of this was what was on the table was actually in the interest of developing countries. And with that, the group of those who proposed domestic regulation disciplines realized that work in the WPDR, at least on the basis that they had, could not proceed. So on that basis, they decided at the ministerial conference in Buenos Aires in 2017 to continue negotiations outside the WPDR among a group of like-minded members. And in Buenos Aires, there was a joint ministerial statement at the time signed by 59 WTO members that agreed to continue negotiations outside the WTO. I'll pause here. Any questions at this stage? I hope I'm audible, actually. But if that's not the case, I continue.
You're audible.
Okay, good. You know, when you talk into the void for a long time, and then you realize you haven't unmuted yourself, that's usually very embarrassing. But I checked, I was unmuted. Okay, so now the plurilateral negotiations in the JSI. What happened now in the JSI after this group left the multilateral track? So I'll give you an overview where things stand now. So currently originally there were 59 members. Currently there are 69 WTO members plus one exceeding government, Timor-Leste, which has joined the initiative. This group altogether covers about 92.5% of all trade in services. So it's a group that encompasses, with the exception of India, all the major services traders. That group came to an agreement by 2 December last year. This agreement is set out in a ministerial declaration where they took note of the conclusions on the negotiations on the reference paper, the disciplines on domestic regulation, and flagged their intention to incorporate these disciplines as additional commitments into the participating members' GATT schedule. And the objective was to do this within 12 months of the declaration by December 2022, subject, of course, to the completion of any required domestic approval procedures. So this is a document, I think it is in your set of documents where you have all the information, including the reference paper itself. Now the question was, how do you incorporate these reference paper obligations into how do you give them legal effect? Here, the members who are part of this joint initiative they think they should go through a certification procedure. This is set out in document SL84. This is based on the notion that GATS Article 21 sets out the right of members to modify their schedules, their commitments. Article 21 allows you to both withdraw a commitment or modify a commitment adversely, so in other words, lower the level of commitment, but you can only do that against compensation where any other member raises their hand and says, we need compensation for this. Because the philosophy of Article 21 is to maintain a mutually advantageous level of benefits. But of course, members can always improve their schedules or make changes that are of a purely technical character that do not alter the scope or substance of existing commitments. And the procedure in document SL84 spells out the procedural steps for doing so. So the members who are taking on these new commitments in the reference paper on domestic regulation, who essentially promise other members to live up to a certain level of regulatory disciplines, they are improving their schedules of commitments, and therefore they have chosen this procedure SL84. And according to this procedure, other members then have 45 days to raise any objections to the certification requests. The idea behind raising an objection is essentially to give members the possibility to scrutinize what other members put in front of them. Because there's always a risk that a member puts something on the table that is not an improvement, but it is a change that may well modify adversely the level of commitments. So therefore, there's always the need for other members to have a review of what's being put on the table. You know? So that's the philosophy. Now, what happened yesterday, and it's good that I have this presentation today and not yesterday, because yesterday, 59 of these participants of the negotiations, they made good on their promise in the declaration and started their certification procedures in line with this SL84 procedure. And I have here for you on this slide, I've quickly put all the document symbols that were issued yesterday afternoon. So you're the first to find out, so to say. So you will see they follow, when you look at these documents, they follow all typical standard cover note that is always used for these types of requests, and then they attach the improved schedule that they have, but of course they do not replicate the entire schedule. They essentially create a horizontal section of the schedule into which they have put a sentence that, for example, Albania will apply the discipline set out in section 2 of document INF SDR2, which is the reference paper. And this will apply then, because it's in the schedule, to all subsequently listed sectors. So these disciplines apply to different sectors for each member, to those sectors that are on their positive list schedule. Go into a little bit more detail on that. Okay, so that's what happened yesterday. As of today, other members have 45 days to look at these schedules. And if no objection is received, the procedure concludes, I believe, on the 3rd of February, and the commitments enter into force for most of these members on the 4th of February next year. Okay. Any questions on this? Okay. And
Hi, Marcus. Just one question. With regard to this JSI, we know there are the balanced members. I don't want to say there are people, members who oppose this JSI, but what are the counter arguments brought by those groups that not to be a part of the JSI?
So can you repeat what are the?
These other members who are not the part of JSI, So their counter argument that they would not like to be the part of this JSI. Is there any prominent arguments from those parties?
Well, I mean, of course, those who are not part of the JSI, they're not forced to be part of the JSI. And those who are not listed here, and there are 10 others who are not able at this stage to start certification because they have still legislation or approval before their parliaments and their processes are not finished. But for anyone who's not part of this JSI, they do not undertake any commitments, so they remain outside. Once these schedules are certified, all other members obtain rights, legal rights from these members that you see here on the screen, that they can hold these members to account with regard to these disciplines. So they obtain additional rights from these members with regard to the DR disciplines, but they do not need to do anything themselves. So there are many other members who are considering joining the JSI, but who have not done so. There are 2 or 3 members who have a fundamental opposition to JSIs generally, both the process and the outcomes of these JSI. That's a discussion that happens in the General Council. They believe these initiatives are on shaky legal ground, to say the least. And we'll see what will happen. There's one person who's not muted. Would that be possible to mute yourself? Yeah, thank you.
I just did.
Okay, thank you. So this is the issue. I mean, there is, of course, just generally, on the JSIs, for most JSIs, there is a fundamental question of how you bring negotiated outcomes by a subgroup of the membership under the WTO rules, because that's what these JSIs want to do. They want to integrate their outcomes into the WTO. And obviously, if you have an agreement, you need to have the cooperation of all other members in bringing this agreement either under the annexes of the Annex 1, for example, of the WTO agreement, or Annex 4 if it's meant to be a plurilateral agreement. But this is only possible if all members agree. For the JSI on domestic regulation, there is already a procedure on how to modify your specific commitments. And since all these elements of these disciplines fit kind of firmly and precisely into the scope of additional commitments, that is a procedure that these members are employing to give a legal effect to that. There are, I think there are some members who feel that is still legally shaky, but nonetheless, for this group, this is the way they have chosen to go forward ahead with. Let me move on then to the substantive content of the reference paper. So here is the reference paper that you see. What does it address? What is a reference paper? Essentially, the objective of this reference paper is to assist services businesses in expanding their trade possibilities. So for services businesses that export abroad, it is sometimes, and it's well documented, that it is challenging to find out about requirements for obtaining licenses. And often there is no one to turn if you have requests to obtain information. And then when suppliers submit applications, at times they're left in the dark on how long the processing times will be and when they can expect approval of their applications. And in some places, documentation requirements are excessive and burdensome, and still, apologies, still rely on paper rather than electronic means, or rely on original documents rather than certified copies. And so in a nutshell, what businesses have long articulated is a transparent, fit-for-purpose requirements and procedures for authorization of service suppliers in another jurisdiction to minimize the unintended consequences of regulations in services sectors. And I should say what's important here is that these disciplines do not address requirements that members set up. So they do not touch the right to regulate of members in terms of setting qualitative levels of protection for their population. The disciplines are almost exclusively addressing procedural elements of authorization. And I'll go over the elements of these disciplines in a nutshell. You have the text. It's relatively short. You can go over it yourself. But I want to flag to you the key elements of these disciplines. So the purpose of the disciplines really is to facilitate trade and services. So you could look at the disciplines as falling under essentially three pillars. The first pillar being transparency, and here the key additional obligations that those who take on the disciplines will commit themselves to are enhanced publication requirements in addition to Article 3 of the GATS. So in other words, to publish and make available essentially all the necessary information to comply with requirements and procedures for authorization. To establish appropriate mechanisms to respond to inquiries from service suppliers. You will remember maybe that the GATS itself has only an intergovernmental mechanism to respond to inquiries. So in other words, inquiries from service suppliers under Article 3 of the GATS, there is no obligation for members to respond to them. And with regard to, there is, of course, for developed country members, there's an obligation to facilitate access to information on certain types of measures and technologies, etc. But that's not necessarily phrased like a proper, inquiry point where a service supplier can turn to and expect to obtain information on how to apply for a license. So this is an additional element. And then you have a number of articles that deal with stakeholder engagement in the context of developing new laws and regulations. So which deals with publication of draft legislation and draft regulations, allowing service suppliers to comment on those and considering the comments received. Now, because this is phrased as a horizontally applicable obligation, this, I should say, is phrased in extremely, very much in best endeavor terms. So there is, and I'll come back to the legal nature of these obligations at the end, and you will see that the vast majority of these obligations are on best endeavor only. The second pillar of obligations relates to legal predictability and certainty. Yeah. And here what we can see is that the objective of the disciplines there is to establish regulatory and procedural guarantees to be followed by competent authorities when they deal with applications. So we're really going into the application process. And this has items and features such as establishing timeframes for processing applications, provide timely information on the status of applications, inform in a timely manner about the decisions that were taken on applications, but also when very often applications are maybe not 100% correctly filled out. So going back to the applicant and tell him what he needs to do or she needs to do to complete these applications fully, and in case of the rejection of an application to inform of the reasons of the rejection and allow the resubmission of an application. Also important is where examinations are required to establish the qualification of a service suppliers. Those should be held at reasonably frequent intervals. There are some other obligations there, but this is in a nutshell what the disciplines cover and what they aim to. There's a third pillar, I would say, and this is a little bit broader, maybe overlaps with the other pillars. Essentially, this is about disseminating good regulatory practices and facilitating the supplier's ability to effectively trade. So you have some disciplines, and I'll not go over all of them here in the interest of time. For example, an encouragement to accept electronic applications and authenticated copies, have licensing fees or authorization fees that are reasonable and transparent and are not in themselves a restriction on the supply of a service. Consolidate information that you make available in an dedicated online portal to make it easier for service suppliers to navigate it. But also make sure that procedures are impartial and that decision-making of competent authorities is independent from the interests of certain service suppliers or groups of service suppliers. So essentially, kind of certain good governance elements that are made concrete with regard to authorization requirements for service suppliers. This is this third pillar that the disciplines cover. There's one discipline, you have it here on the screen, that is very novel, that does not exist in any other WTO outcomes. And this is a requirement that where a member adopts or maintains measures relating to authorization, such measures shall not discriminate between men and women. So a non-discrimination provision between men and women. However, here important to see the footnote that would allow temporary measures to accelerate de facto equality between men and women. So certain affirmative action, I hope that's not the wrong term for this, provisions would be sanctioned in order to essentially accelerate equality. For this provision originally proposed by Canada was took a while before it was generally accepted among the participants. And therefore, this is the only discipline where members who are part of the JSI have a right to opt out from. But in practice, none of the 69 participants of the JSI has made use of this possibility to opt out. So for all of these members, this discipline will also apply. Also to mention that the substance of the disciplines is contained in section 2 of the reference paper, but there is also a section 3 which has the title Alternative Disciplines on Services Domestic Regulation in Financial Services. So it's a special section for financial services which members can choose, so that's why it's alternative. They can choose for their, when they make their commitments, to go either with section 2 or with section 3 for financial services. The section 3 takes section 2 as the basis, but makes some modifications. Overall, we can say that section 3 is less complete and a little bit weaker with regard to some provisions. Most importantly here, section 3 does not apply to technical standards. So whatever technical standards are deemed to be for financial services, the text does not discipline those. It deletes certain paragraphs from the disciplines. For example, the paragraph on recognition. In this case, simply because recognition, the paragraph on recognition in the general disciplines relates really to professional bodies, so it is perhaps not relevant to financial services. But it also removes certain transparency requirements, so information on fees, technical standards, and indicative timeframes are not listed in the list of measures that need to be made available. Fees, here importantly, the fee obligation has become for financial services a transparency obligation, essentially. So fees do not have to be reasonable, really. And then there was a footnote with regard to one other article where reference to health and environmental requirements has been removed again because they're not relevant really for financial services. So you'll ask me probably why is there this special treatment of financial services? Essentially, the reason for this is that the United States, when they decided to come on board with this, they felt that their financial services regulators could not go along with the horizontal disciplines, and they demanded some changes for themselves. And then, of course, they offered these changes as an alternative so that everyone could choose to take essentially less binding, less ambitious disciplines for financial services, which then subsequently, once that was put to the other members who are part of the group, the vast majority of these other members also chose. So in practice, I think except for 5 or 6 participants, all other members choose for financial services the weaker disciplines in Section 3. Now, coming to flexibilities. First of all, for developing country members, there is a 7-year transitional period that they can designate for themselves for the implementation of any of these disciplines. What they would need to do is inscribe in their schedule for which discipline and for which services sectors they need transitional periods for implementation and how long these transitional periods should be. So I believe we have also 5 or 6 developing country participants who have availed themselves of this possibility to schedule a limited number of transitional periods, some of them only for 1 paragraph or 2 paragraphs, and others for a little bit longer more paragraphs. And the periods that were designated were between 3 and 7 years. So it's on a self-designation basis, but it's not a blanket application of a 7-year period for all the disciplines. So each member has to schedule it for themselves. For LDCs, the group maintained essentially the long-standing consensus from the earlier multilateral negotiations that LDCs should not be required to take on legal obligations. So therefore, any LDC participant would only be required to schedule their commitments, the reference paper as a commitment, upon graduation from their LDC status, and would then have the possibility to designate transitional periods in line with paragraph 10 of the reference paper. So at this stage, of course, LDCs would be encouraged to implement domestically the disciplines, but there would be no legal bindingness until they have submitted a schedule after graduation. There is an interesting provision on technical assistance and capacity building, not only for the implementation of the disciplines, but going further, assisting individual service suppliers also to navigate essentially the complex regulation in many developed country markets. But all this technical assistance is, I would say, kind of, it's technical assistance light, you know. There's no equivalent to a trade facilitation facility or alliance that actually practically is committed to making changes on the ground. At the moment, this paragraph 13 is a provision that essentially encourages members to provide technical assistance on mutually agreed terms and conditions. So, but of course, given that very few developing countries have asked for transitional periods, the others are already implementing the disciplines from the date of entry into force. Perhaps technical assistance is in practice, certainly for the implementation, is in practice not as important an issue as it is for in other areas, like, for example, investment facilitation or with regard to trade facilitation for trading goods. And then I should also mention that about 2/3, if not more, of the disciplines are phrased in flexible language. So typically the obligations are phrased that members shall, to the extent practicable, carry out an obligation. And many other obligations are written in a best endeavor nature. So in other words, should or shall endeavor to, or are encouraged to. So these are the phrases that qualify the obligations in the text. And this was seen necessary to get the broadest possible buy-in, to make these disciplines really acceptable to the largest number of participants, and to give them the sense of safety and that they do not legally expose themselves if they sign up to the reference paper in its entirety, if in practice for certain sectors they are actually not able at this stage to fulfill the disciplines or to implement the disciplines. That's why this flexible, horizontal flexibility language was seen to be necessary. Now, this is very briefly how this will look, or how this looks also then in the certification request. So you will see a horizontal section. You will see member undertakes as additional commitments the disciplines of section 2 in INF SDR2. That's the reference paper. And then you have certain possibilities how to schedule transitional periods, to use the financial services alternative, to opt out from the discrimination language, but also to extend the sectoral coverage. So what does that mean? As I said before, the disciplines apply to those sectors in which the participating members have already specific commitments. Now, for some WTO members, that is very few sectors. You know, there are some who have made in the Uruguay round only commitments in 20 sectors, whereas for others, especially recently exceeded members, they have commitments like Georgia, which is a member in 146 sectors out of 160. So there's a big disparity. And in order to kind of move towards bridging that disparity, the reference paper has a paragraph that encourages members, where they can, to also apply the reference paper to sectors that are not in their schedule yet. So what these members are doing is they inscribe new sectors in their schedule, to which they then say, we apply the reference paper obligations, but we are not obliged, we're not taking market access or national treatment obligations, but we promise to apply the reference paper obligations. Well, so that's another feature of these disciplines. And there are 9 participants in the negotiations who have made use of this. So these would be, for example, countries like Chile, which has a very small GATT schedule, but has since the mid-90s engaged in extensive regional agreements, often on a negative list basis, and who felt comfortable to do that. Also Hong Kong, China, or New Zealand have also added new sectors, but also developing countries like Costa Rica, for example. Okay. Just to mention that when the declaration was adopted in December, business associations from around the world welcomed that outcome. So you have the Global Express Association, you have the Coalition of Services Industry, the European Services Forum. I put some quotes here for you on that slide. Now, very briefly, because we are running out of time and I want to give you the possibility to pose questions also. There has been a little bit of research done by the WTO in a staff working paper and also by the OECD. The WTO research focuses on two aspects: on trying to assess to what extent the disciplines that are developed are actually really novel, or to what extent similar disciplines have already been incorporated in regional trade agreements. And here you can see on this slide, you can see in the dark, in the large shaded area, you can see the rise, the increase of services RTAs in the last 20 years. So you can see that particularly since 2005, there has been a strong rise in the conclusion of RTAs that have services components. And what you then can see in these different lines, each line stands for one type of measure that we have taken out, that since about 2006, 7 or 2010, there has been a trend towards integrating certain types of disciplines into the RTA texts. And the timing is not coincidental. You will remember that I said the multilateral negotiations on DR took really off in 2005, 2006. And so members felt comfortable starting to put this into their regional agreements. And then this accelerated, particularly after 2010, when essentially for a while the multilateral avenue was a little bit closed and members felt the only place in which they can pursue domestic regulation is in the regional arena. So that's when it really took off, and it has become kind of a common feature of RTAs ever since. Just to give you an overview, and you'll have more information on this in the staff working paper that is in your materials. If you go by the 3 pillars of measures that the disciplines address, you will see that high-income economies have by and large incorporated them into RTAs, and then upper middle income economies have done so to a lesser extent. Lower and low income economies also to a lesser and lesser extent. Partly, I have to say, it's also the reason for this could be that many low-income economies are not as much engaged in RTA conclusion as other countries. But you see also that for certain type of provisions, for example, transparency, also lower middle-income economies have about 40% of lower, or more than 40% of lower middle-income economies have put equivalent disciplines in their RTAs, which would signal that they're generally able to implement or have a confidence themselves to implement such disciplines, really. Finally, the OECD colleagues have also carried out research, and their angle was, would the implementation of these disciplines lower trade costs for services? And they have based this on their own services trade restrictiveness index. And they have, you see here for a range of services sectors, they have predicted partly substantial reductions in trade cost for certain sectors like commercial banking, telecommunications, etc. With an average suggestion that trade costs would be lower by about 11%. By about 11% if all participants were to fully implement the substance of these disciplines. So obviously not if they avail themselves of all the flexibilities, but if they actually implement across their sectors these disciplines, trade costs would fall significantly. And the tune of that was quoted by the OECD was that the savings in trade costs would be in the range of $150 billion per year. And here you can also see that on this slide, you can see that the biggest benefits of these trade cost savings would be accruing to JSI participants, the blue part of each bar, because they, of course, are implementing the reforms. But also non-participants, so services suppliers for non-participants would benefit from the implementation because their services and service suppliers would face lower regulatory barriers when they enter the markets of the JSI participants. But the OECD policy brief says clearly the biggest benefits will come from implementing the disciplines back at home. WTO research has had a different approach. We have tried to correlate the implementation of the disciplines with other economic indicators. So what you see on these scatter plot charts, for example, is we have put together the level of implementation with, for example, on the left side, you see the level of services trade. And you can see, and if you're an economist particularly, you can see that countries that have implemented the more DR disciplines are typically trading more services. So these are correlations. So we don't know which one causes which one. We cannot prove it, but there is certainly a stronger link. And also similarly, countries that have implemented more DR disciplines, in other words, have probably better regulatory systems with regard to these types of measures, are also participating to a greater extent in global value chains. And in the WTO staff working paper, you will see a number of other correlations relating to entrepreneurship, telecom prices, etc. So all of which point in the same direction, that which in a way is then, I would say, a little bit commonsensical, that where you have a better regulatory system with less deadweight losses through poor regulation, you will have generally lower prices, more competition, and better economic performance. So this is, I think, all I have. Yes, this is all I have for you. This was a little bit too quick, perhaps. But I'm very happy to open the floor for questions, to respond to any questions that you may have. Thank you. No questions on domestic regulation? Okay. I see we have lost a few participants. Now then, if that is not the case, I can just repeat my offer that since I'm the responsible in the Secretariat for these negotiations, for the whole file, if you have any follow-up questions, maybe when you study the slides, please do not hesitate to write me an email, get in touch with me. I'm very happy to respond to anything that is of interest to you, to the best of my ability. Now, I think this brings us then to the end of the 3-day training. I thank you all very much for your attendance. I would like to know if anyone wants to have a closing comment. I don't know what the idea was from your side.
Hi, Marcus. Yes, I'm Sam from the Department of Commerce. Let me make a very brief concluding remarks. We convene this services seminar in the background of different reasons, not only understanding the trading services in multilateral context, but also in the regional context as well. So I think we had a greater participation in first day and the second day as well, and hope the private sector and the government line agencies get some understanding on the broader discipline on trading services, which helps us as the Ministry of Trade to interact more meaningful way with line ministries. That is one of the reasons we call for other agencies. So I think this won't be the end, and we may shoot some email and for further clarification, and we know we can get the help from the expertise from the WTO. Having said this, I would like to thank again the head of the technical training division and of the director of the trade and investment division, and all speakers and resource persons, including the secretariat staff, for supporting us for concluding these 3-day events. And thank you so much. And this is from our end, from Department of Commerce side. Thank you very much, Marcus. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. And we're always happy to do these events virtually or in person now. You know, this one was an event that was for a while in the planning. You know, we are relatively flexible. If you from your department want to have a briefing over Zoom, for example, on a specific topic, or just, you know, just have with your team consultation on something, we're available to do that. From our side, if it's not something that is multi-day or very long, if you want to have a 1.5-hour chat, from our side, we don't need any. You can just approach me. I'm coordinating TA in the division. We can do this without any bureaucracy, you know. What you have to do to go through missions, etc., making it official, that I don't know, but you know, we are always happy to engage. I think with we have been in touch by email before, Sam, and so we can also do briefings, of course, now with technology in the same manner. So we are happy to the extent that you want our input, to accompany you, to assist you, to point you into directions maybe where you can find additional information, because it is, I think it is a slightly daunting task to engage fully informed and with a lot of confidence in these regional negotiations, particularly if your counterparts are much better resourced than you are. So if we can contribute to close the gap even to a little bit, we would be most pleased. That's really our, from a secretariat point, that's our objective, really. That's why we're there. That's how we see ourselves, as a kind of a facilitator and assistant to countries like yours. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Max. Thank you.
Okay, so then let me just wish you a happy end of the year. For us in the WTO, we stop work now on Friday, and we only come back on the 3rd of January. I don't know what the arrangements are for you over the New Year period, but I hope you get some rest. 2022 was another difficult year, another very difficult year, and let's hope that the next year will be better for everyone, both for you in Sri Lanka as well as for everyone else in the world. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.